Greetings, everyone. We're going to start a two-part series on pruning. In part one, we will discuss the reasons why plants are pruned. And in part two, we'll zoom in on the pruning specifically of trees and shrubs. But before we go any further, I think we need to check in with Ollie to see what he thinks of the whole affair. Hey, Ollie. Are you ready for a lecture on pruning? Put a paw up if you're ready for a lecture on pruning. Come on, buddy. Throw me a bone here. Come on, Ollie. Give me a paw. There are some definitions that we need to consider before we start this series on pruning. One question that you may have is what defines a tree or a shrub? So I found a definition for a tree, and it goes as follows. A tree is a woody plant having one dominant vertical trunk and a height greater than 15 feet. But the question is, does this definition always work? So if you look at the picture on the right, you see sugar maple, Acer saccharum, most of a tree. In the middle, you see a picture of river birch, Betula nigra. If you look closely at the river birch, you see that it has multiple stems or multiple trunks. So this is an example of a multi-stemmed tree. And then over on the right, you see a picture of arrowwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. This, most of us would agree, is a shrub. So sometimes the line between tree or shrub is a difficult one to draw. Trees morph into shrubs, shrubs morph into trees. So there is no one perfect definition for a tree or shrub. Moving on, this is the typical presentation of a tree, how it grows, how its root system grows. So the top of the tree, including the branches with leaves, would be referred to as the crown of the tree. The main stem of the tree would be referred to as the trunk of the tree. This is another look at a tree. In this tree, there's some new terminology that we are going to introduce. So we're looking at what they call a lead branch. So this would be the main vertical axis of the tree, and often this lead branch is referred to simply as a leader. Coming off the lead branch are scaffold branches. Scaffold branches develop from the sides of the leader or main vertical axis of the tree. The angle that you see forming when a scaffold branch connects to the leader is called the crotch or crotch angle. Finally, you see the trunk of the tree, and then developing from the root system you see suckers. So suckers develop from the root system of a plant. And then one other term, water sprouts. Water sprouts are branches that develop on the main trunk or leader above ground. They do not come from the root system. They develop from latent buds that are just underneath the bark. Water sprouts often form as a response to pruning. So if too much of the canopy of a tree is removed during pruning, the tree often responds by forming water sprouts. Here's another picture showing that crotch angle that we spoke of earlier. So if you look at the picture on the left, you see the main trunk of the tree and a scaffold branch, but you see that that crotch angle is narrow. Okay, that indicates a weak point of attachment. Over on the right, you see another picture showing a trunk and a scaffold branch, but in this picture we have a much wider angle. This wide angle indicates a very strong branch attachment to the trunk. Drip line is a term that we've seen before and I've used in class before. So the drip line of a tree is simply the projection of the canopy or crown of the tree onto the ground. So really the drip line would form a ring or a circle around the trunk of the tree, with the trunk at the very center of this particular circle. Pruning, as you probably already know, is really both an art and a science. So we're going to explore a little bit of the art and a little bit of the science of pruning. And we'll start out by discussing some of the scientific principles involved in pruning. One of the primary principles that need to be discussed regarding pruning is the principle of apical dominance. And the principle of apical dominance works like this. There is a naturally occurring plant hormone called IAA, which stands for indole 3-acetic acid. This plant hormone is produced by terminal buds. High concentrations of IAA inhibit the growth of lateral buds. Removing the terminal bud during pruning removes the source of the IAA, and as the concentration of IAA in the stem decreases because the terminal bud was removed during pruning, the lateral buds then are allowed to break and push out new growth. So let's take a look at an illustration that describes this. Alright, so we're looking at two pictures. On the left we have a twig or stem that has an alternate bud arrangement. On the right we have a stem that has an opposite bud arrangement. The dark hatched line indicates a pruning cut that you make. So if you look at the picture on the left, you see a terminal bud. That terminal bud produces IAA. That hormone translocates through the stem and suppresses the development of the lateral buds on the side of the stem. When you come along and make a pruning cut, as you see with the hatched line, you remove the terminal bud. The concentration of IAA in the stem decreases, and some of those lateral buds are allowed to break and grow and push out a new shoot, which ultimately becomes the stem itself, bearing additional buds. The same thing is occurring in the picture on the right. The terminal bud produces the IAA. The IAA is translocated down the stem. It suppresses the development of the lateral buds. You make a pruning cut. When you make that pruning cut, you remove the source of IAA, and the lateral buds are allowed to break. This is a nice shot showing what bud break looks like. So bud break is just simply a bud responding to environmental signals such as are occurring right now in Texas. The days are getting longer, the temperatures are getting warmer, the apical meristem inside those buds is starting to become active, cell division is occurring, and during bud break, a new shoot, and remember that a shoot is just simply a young stem with leaves, a new shoot will emerge from that bud. So that's a little bit of the science behind pruning, but we also said that pruning is an art, and if you look at this picture, this is an example of what we call topiary. So topiary is the art of pruning shrubs into different shapes. And here you have two elephants with a baby elephant. So obviously there are several shrubs that are involved in making this topiary. And I would imagine it probably works something like this. So if you look at the lead elephant, I would say that there's probably at least 4 plants that were started. And I imagine that somebody put a cage or a form over those plants, and that form was maybe made out of something like chicken wire. So as the plants grew through the form, the gardeners would come by and prune those branches. Of course, when you prune something, you cause more branching. So over time, you got additional branching, and the inside of the form was filled with shoots and leaves. All right, let's talk about some of the main objectives of pruning. So think of these pruning objectives as being the reasons why we prune plants, and there can be many different reasons. We're going to talk about 7 reasons why people prune plants. The first reason is reducing the potential for tree or branch failure. Sometimes trees have been known to come down during storms or under snow loads, and there is pruning that we can do ahead of time that will limit this potential for branch failure. Another reason we prune plants is to provide clearance, and here we're speaking specifically about clearance for utility lines, power lines, things like that. We have to keep the branches of trees away from the power lines so they don't interfere or damage the power lines. Sometimes we prune to reduce shade and wind resistance. So perhaps you have a tree in your front yard that is producing a lot of shade, and the grass underneath that tree is not growing very well, and you want to do some pruning to kind of thin out the canopy of the tree to get more light onto that grass so the grass will grow better. So this would be an example of reducing shade. Along with that, you can reduce the wind resistance. The canopy of a tree provides a huge sail for the wind to blow against. So when you do thin the canopy, you are reducing wind resistance by allowing that wind to blow through the canopy a little bit better. Maintaining health and structure is really one of the primary reasons why people prune trees. And we'll talk more about some of the types of pruning that you can do to maintain health and structure. We also prune to promote flower and or fruit production on various plants. We may prune plants to improve visibility. So this would be a safety issue where perhaps a tree or a shrub has kind of grown over or obscured the view of a traffic sign. That's important for people to see. So we may have to prune back trees or shrubs to improve visibility so that we can see around corners, so that we can see traffic better, so that we can see road signs better. And finally, the last reason we may choose to prune a plant is simply for aesthetics. We like to shape plants into various forms. You just saw a picture of topiary earlier. Topiary is the perfect example of pruning for aesthetics. All right, here's a picture of tree failure. So this tree came down during a storm, presumably during a windstorm, and it damaged the house that was near the tree. So there is pruning that we can do proactively to try to prevent this from happening. This is an example of pruning for power line clearance. So providing clearance was an objective that we just discussed earlier. This is a great picture showing pruning to reduce shade. So really what was done in this particular picture or series of pictures was the crown of the tree was thinned out. So you can see the before and after pictures, and you can note how much thinner the crown is now and how much more light is going to be able to reach the ground because of that thinning that occurred. When it comes to pruning trees for maintaining health and structure, there are what we call the 3 Ds of pruning. And that is remove any branches that are dead, diseased, or dysfunctional. Dysfunctional meaning the branch really no longer plays an important role in the structure of that tree. It's dysfunctional. Okay, so here's a picture of a tree, And this particular tree has several problems that are identified by the letters that you see on the screen. So let's go ahead and go through these different letters and identify these different problems. So these are all examples of dysfunctional branches that would warrant pruning. If we start with A down near the bottom of the tree, so A represents sucker growth coming from the root system, and generally that kind of growth we want to remove. And we want to do it as early as possible, and we would use a pair of hand pruners, bypass pruners, to do this kind of pruning. We would approach the tree, get down on our hands and knees, and make these cuts as close to the ground as possible. The reason you want to remove suckers is because if you don't remove them, you're going to turn a tree like this, which has a nice central leader, essentially into a shrub, because over time those root suckers are going to grow up, they're going to get larger in diameter, and the tree is going to lose its form. So B represents broken branches. Any branch on a tree that's broken should be removed. A broken branch is just a way for an infection to start in a tree. It's an open wound. We don't want those on trees. Broken branches or stubs, which are short branches from perhaps earlier pruning cuts, need to be removed. C, that branch represents a downward growing branch. Well, these are important to remove because that branch is going to interfere perhaps with mowing around that tree, or if the tree is close to a sidewalk, that branch could possibly be growing kind of down towards the sidewalk, which means that people walking on that sidewalk are going to have to move around that branch, otherwise they're going to get it right in their faces. So downward growing branches like this are important to remove if the tree is in a urban environment, especially near a sidewalk where you're going to be mowing around it or people might be walking by. Rubbing or crossing branches, as illustrated by letter D, these are important to remove because two branches that are rubbing against one another are going to rub the bark off of each other. And of course, when you rub the bark off of a branch, you create a wound that could be an entry site for some type of pathogen. So removing rubbing or crossing branches is always a good idea. E represents a shaded interior branch. So this is a branch that's not really growing out or away from the main leader of the tree. This is a branch that's kind of growing into the crown of the tree. So these shaded interior branches should be removed. F represents competing leaders. So if you look at the tree illustrated, you see that it has two leaders that are competing with one another. The one on the left is a little bit shorter, the one on the right is a little bit bigger. Now, if you left those competing leaders, you would develop what are called codominant stems. That's not a good thing. So really, you want to remove one of these leaders as early as possible. And generally what you do is remove the smaller or thinner leader and let the taller, thicker leader stay in place. Letter G represents a narrow crotch angle. We discussed this earlier in the presentation, where narrow crotch angles between lateral branches and the main trunk or leader do not form strong points of attachment. So branches that have narrow crotch angles, like branch G, should be removed. And finally, the last one is H, which represents whorls of branches. Really, H, it's simply a matter of how much space you want between those lateral branches. So if you look at the left-hand side of the tree, you can see that branch H is in between two other lateral branches that are spaced further apart. So you want good spacing between those lateral branches, and H is just kind of interfering with that good spacing. So H would be a branch that you would want to remove. This is the desired outcome. So we want a tree with a strong central leader and well-spaced scaffold or lateral branches. So if you look at the picture, left-hand side, you see a young tree that was recently planted in the landscape. And you may ask, well, why were all those lower lateral branches left in place? And there really is a simple and good explanation for this. Those lower lateral branches are going to form leaves, and those leaves are going to photosynthesize and create sugars, and that energy is going to be used to develop trunk caliper, and it will also be used to help that young tree get established in the landscape. So after planting, it's a good idea to leave those lower lateral branches on for a couple years, and then they can be pruned off later. So moving to the right, we see the tree after 3 to 4 years. We have removed some of those lower lateral branches. We still left a couple in place. We still want to add to the trunk caliper. After 5 to 7 years, we have removed all of those lower lateral branches. The tree has been limbed up. So if that tree is near a sidewalk or a street, it's easy for us to mow around that tree, and there are no low lateral branches that are going to interfere with mowing or people walking by the tree. And then finally, you see the tree 15 years after planting. So remember, it's a good idea to leave lower lateral branches on a newly planted tree to help produce sugars to add to trunk caliper. Okay, so I just showed you a picture of what we're hoping to achieve, but the question is that always achievable? And really the answer is no, and the reason for that is simply that not all trees grow with a strong central leader. So pictured here, you have two different trees and they have two different growth habits. The tree on the left has an X-current growth habit. So an X-current growth habit is a tree with a strong central leader and lateral branches that develop from that central leader. On the right hand side is pictured a tree that has a decurrent growth habit. This type of tree does not have a strong central leader. Now I suppose if you worked really hard at it, and if you started at a really young age in the nursery, it would be possible to take a tree with a decurrent growth habit and turn it into a tree that has an X-current growth habit, but usually we don't do that. So we have to treat trees with decurrent growth habits a little bit differently. And in the second part of the lecture series, we'll discuss the differences in pruning these two types of growth habits. Pruning fruit trees. So really with fruit trees, your main objective is to open up the canopy for a couple different reasons. Number one is you want to get more light into the canopy of the tree. The light helps develop the fruit and helps the fruit color properly. Another reason for kind of pruning the center out is to promote good airflow, to keep the leaves dry so we don't get leaf diseases developing on our fruit trees. So fruit trees are often pruned like you see here. They don't have a central leader. They kind of look like a martini glass, kind of a vase-shaped form. The idea being prune out those branches in the center. This is another example of pruning fruit trees. So these are apple trees that have been espaliered. They're on an espaliered fence. So when you grow a plant like this, you're essentially taking a three-dimensional plant and turning it into a two-dimensional plant. So espaliered plants have height and they have width, but they really don't have much depth. So why would you want to do this? Well, I think what's going on here is this may be a you-pick orchard. So when you take an apple tree and shape it like this, you keep the fruit at a level where it's easier for the customers to reach and pick the fruit off the tree. Also, you get great light. You get light from both sides. So you've really increased the amount of light that's getting into the main part of the tree there to help develop that fruit and develop good color on the fruit. This is an example of an apple tree that was espaliered and grown on the side of a house. So you can see it's right up against the brick. So undoubtedly whoever did this needed to use or have some method of attaching those stems to the brick, of fastening them to the brick to get them to kind of grow in that fashion. And then you can see the fruit developing on those stems. Okay, this is when we talk about pruning for improved visibility. So inside the red circle you see a traffic sign, and that traffic sign has been obscured by the branches of the vegetation in front of it. So sometimes we have to prune just to remove that vegetation, to remove those branches so that we can see traffic signs better. I mean, think about it. How many times have you pulled up to an intersection and not been able to see very well because of a tree or a shrub that was planted too close to that intersection? So pruning for improved visibility is important when it comes to traffic safety and safety on the road. Okay, this is an example of just purely pruning for aesthetics. There's really no reason to do this except that it looks pretty, and it's fun to see. It's an enormous amount of work to develop plants like this and to keep them maintained like this, but it's something that you see a lot of in Europe and in some of the older established gardens or arboretums in the United States. This is a ginkgo tree that has been espaliered up against a building. All right, we're going to shift gears, talk a little bit about pruning annual and herbaceous perennial plants. There is something that we can do to annuals and herbaceous perennial plants called pinching. And pinching is a type of pruning that we do with our fingers. So we don't really need any type of pruning tools to do this. Usually we can just do this with our fingers, and this is something that we do when plants are very young. So we're taking our fingers and we're removing the terminal shoot off of these plants. Now when you do that, you're going to remove the source of IAA that we had talked about earlier, and you're going to cause this plant to branch. So pinching is done on herbaceous plants, so plants that do not have a persistent woody above ground stem, and it's done at a very early age, and it's primarily done to increase branching and develop a fuller plant. Deadheading is simply the removal of spent flowers. So in the landscape, after our annuals produce flowers, well, we all know that fruit develops after flowering. So the question is, do you want your annual plants to put their energy into the development of fruit, or would you prefer that the annual plants put their energy into the production of more flowers? Well, most of us would agree that we plant annuals for color. We plant annuals for their flowers. So we want to remove those spent flowers to promote additional flowering. Okay, so this is the end of part 1. In part 2, we will take a closer look at pruning trees and shrubs. We'll discuss the difference between pruning trees with an excurrent and decurrent growth habit, and we will take a closer look at some of these specific types of pruning cuts that we can use to prune trees and shrubs. Thanks for watching.